All right. Oh, wow, that's loud. Okay. I will not be so close. Welcome. It's 1:36 to the Advocacy Issues and Programs Committee. We will start with a roll call. So, Jeff, you'll do that.
My red light's on. Check. That's much better. I was wondering why I couldn't hear myself. I thought maybe I was just too close to me. So Joy Andrade is excused. Chris Clark does not appear to be with us. Bruce is here, and so we will pick back up with Diane Fleet. She told me she's on her way, so she will be late. Janice James is excused. Kathy Ploman. Bo Revlett.
Here.
And Alicia Branham. All right. Bo, we would be ready for the next item on the agenda.
Great. Okay, so then we'll also do introductions of all the people who are non-board, and Kathy Plowman has walked in. So, great. So just share name and your agency, please. So we can start back here.
Ryan Geider with Independence Place.
Elena Gill, Independence Place.
Caitlin Dixon, Housing Advocacy and Community Development with the city.
Christina Ellison, New Beginnings Bluegrass. Jamie Cody, Bluegrass Care Navigators.
Julie Joseph, NAMI Lexington.
Dana Barthel, Lexington Public Library.
Naomi Cluett, Lexington Public Library.
Ben Taylor, I'm with the Lexington Police Department. I'm part of our community paramedicine program.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Ploman, council member for the 12th District and board member.
I'm
All right, and I am Jeff Heron, Homelessness Prevention Manager with LFUCG's Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
I'm Devin. I'm with Natalie's Sisters.
All right, thank you all. And now we will move on to approval of minutes. So last meeting, April 26th, minutes are in the packet. Are there any questions or corrections to the minutes? Can we get a motion for approval?
Move approval.
Okay, in a second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, minutes approved. So first, new business, we have Jeff will share on emergency shelter needs and updates.
Yeah, so I wanted to place this item on the agenda so that we can start some conversations around our emergency shelter system, its needs, and kind of where we see that going in the future. One thing that had prompted this conversation would be that the Salvation Army did have some concerns for the safety of their residents and their dignity about trying to prevent levels of overcrowding where they might have persons due to overflow that might be in walkways, things like that. And what's really important is that a need for everyone to understand that LFUCG and the COC are definitely wanting to make sure that we are adequately meeting people's needs, but we also need to make sure that those conversations take place as a system and as a community. None of our shelters operate within a vacuum, and so if there's a sudden change that we need to make, we need to also be able to plan other resources to help fill any gaps that might exist, and to communicate those plans to our other partners and to those that we are trying to connect with assistance. This unfortunately was a situation where I was not immediately aware of the change. And so when we had persons that were calling our office or engaging our street outreach teams, we ended up giving bad referral information and sending folks to the Salvation Army, who then were told that they were full and not able to serve them. And so what that means is we want to operate a system that is transparent, that is hopefully easier to navigate for individuals that are in need of assistance. And we also have to be mindful that a lot of people are already very distrusting of government and of systems in general. So we also further damage those relationships when we're not able to all be on the same page and have the same information to better help those that we're seeking to serve. So one thing that I definitely wanted for those of you in the room to be aware of and to share with other stakeholders that might have a hand in trying to assist this population is that thankfully we had already been in the process of reallocating some of the Emergency Solutions Grant coronavirus funds. Those funds carry a federal expenditure deadline of the end of September. And so we had worked in grants to reach out to some of the subrecipients that had CV funding remaining, project out what their needs were going to be through close of their program, and identified any funds that they might not utilize. And we rerouted those funds to open back up the temporary shelter activity operated by Community Action Council. And so what that had allowed us to do during the pandemic was to place persons into motel rooms as temporary shelter, particularly if they would be more vulnerable to COVID-19. So we worked as soon as we learned of the changes happening at Salvation Army to expedite that process. I was able to get a double reading at council, and we quickly got that agreement executed. And so over the last week or two, Community Action Council has been able to start operating that program and to place some persons into shelter in hotel that would otherwise be potentially facing shelters that might be full or that they might be restricted from or have other significant barriers. So I can definitely invite Evan, if you have anything to add, to share a little bit more if there's any details that he would like for the group to know. But Community Action Council, as the direct subrecipient of those funds, would be the point of contact, and that would be their High Street office. The main number there is 859-233-4600. They obviously will need to prioritize those persons that do have a confirmed barrier to being able to access other shelter, and their agreement's going to run through the end of August because we're going to need to, as LFUCG, as a direct recipient of those funds, have just a little bit of time to process and close out before the federal deadline. Evan, did you have anything that you might want the group to know about how to get connected with that assistance or other details they might need?
I mean, you hit on pretty much all the points. Just get in touch with us. You can also speak to myself or any of my colleagues in the housing program, and we'll pretty much know what you're trying to get at, and we'll work with the folks as soon as we can. So we've got a dedicated team of folks for helping those folks get in touch with them immediately. So we started housing some people right away. So we probably got about, I'd say we're operating about 14 rooms to this point. We bumped up, I want to say 6 just this week. So far. So yeah. Feel free to give us a call.
And we just want to also thank Community Action Council for their work on this program. We know that you all have unfortunately been in the space of having to operate some motel programming over the last couple of years to supplement our system. We know it's a challenging program to operate, but it's really been helpful in filling some of these gaps and meeting the needs for the community. So thank you for that. So since we kind of have this discussion open and on the floor, I just want to use this as an opportunity to check in with any of our other providers that feel like we might have some concerns or issues regarding emergency shelter to go ahead and put on the table. LFUCG has already worked on a committee to develop a response for the upcoming winter. We've had some great and productive conversations toward that to reimagine our winter response so that hopefully we're not going to be relying on things like a motel program that can be extremely costly. In addition to just the amount that we're charged for rooms that can fluctuate with events, there's then the concern about whether or not rooms are available. There's oftentimes charges for damages to rooms, which might be better served with operating a program on a different model. We hope that also that winter plan and what that eventually comes to be will help to lead us towards a more permanent low barrier shelter in the future. But in the meantime, recognizing that we do have some issues and some gaps with our shelter system, that it's highly segregated by gender and population, and that we do have some challenges, I just want to open the floor if there's anybody that wants to go ahead and start some conversations right now.
Do you know in the future, the Salvation Army, the plan, how many people what's the difference in the number that they've kept?
So in their application for extended social resource funding, they had included a bed capacity of 171 beds. And that, I believe, is going to point to their year-round beds. I know that sometimes in the past they've recorded numbers on the housing inventory count as high as 200 or just a little over when you factor in those overflow beds. And my understanding from their presentation last week at Program Performance and Evaluation is that their new adjusted bed capacity would be 158. And so overall, that's going to be a reduction of just under 20 beds, but sometimes the numbers might be a little bit lower than that, particularly when it comes to their family units. They've tried to move away from mixing families within an individual family room because of some of the conflicts and issues that can arise from that. And so depending on how many persons are in a family household, that might impact the number of beds that are actually available for use. But ballpark, they'd be looking at about 158.
Are we going to need to address the difference if they're not going to have overflow in the...
So one thing is we'll definitely need to factor in their concerns regarding our winter response for sure. Now in that committee, we pulled data from multiple different points throughout the winter season, and the numbers that we're using to develop our response are actually the numbers that we had during the polar vortex over Christmas, trying to identify what the absolute maximum of persons might be that we would need to serve. So over the entire winter season, we'd be looking at, short of having things like the motel program or other seasonal programs, a gap of about 160 to 200 beds. And so in this scenario, I would aim towards the higher end of that range just to account for the potential that they may or may not find a strategy to get some additional beds online at their facility now. I think they're open to doing that if that's something that they're able to do safely. I just don't know when that would occur and if that's ultimately going to happen. In terms of the long term, I think that's going to be something that we definitely have a little bit of alleviation of the pressure right now in the summer months with the hotel funding that Community Action Council has. But I think we're going to need to quickly assess whether the Salvation Army is going to be able to add beds or whether this is going to be something that would be a more permanent reduction within our system. And not to put anybody on the spot, I know we do have some other shelter providers here. Is there anybody that has concerns about things that they want to bring to the table for us to be aware of or thinking of as part of this conversation?
I just want to, oh, I'm sorry, were you going to talk? You go.
I need to get a thing on the microphone. Oh, okay.
I don't know that I had anything, so I was just, and I came in late, so I don't want to add something. You know, our concern certainly around winter weatherization, we're just finding right now still a lot of folks have animals and pets, and I'm finding a lot of folks with mental health and just really struggling with where to get them. So a reduction for Salvation Army is going to be a real, you know, we depend on them a lot. So, but I don't know if that fits 100% in this conversation.
Yeah, it does tie into this conversation. Definitely when we're looking at our response for the winter, we're thinking extremely low barrier. We want to make sure that that's something that has some capacity to address things like pets, also making sure it has the ability to address couples. What we're presently looking at would be different layers of response. So where we previously operated with the activation of our emergency winter weather plan, that would kind of be phase one of that plan. We would just ask for, at that stage, when we do have inclement weather and the plan is activated, that like in past years, that providers would seek to relax restrictions, admit persons with more minor offenses back into shelter, and if they can safely and adequately do so, look for ways to operate some overflow beds. Then we would have a level of that plan that would trigger a season-long response, hopefully, rather than an as-needed response. That would be something taken in kind of a note from the fact that we did have the resource of the Safe Harbor Warming Center, but making that a more robust option that would be able to serve the bulk of the individuals, and then a limited amount of hotel funding for those that maybe wouldn't be appropriate for that environment. You know, those that have more significant mental health or mobility challenges, for example, that might not do well in that environment, and some of our disabled and elderly populations. So it's definitely going to be a mixed kind of method, and then I think that will give us maybe some lessons learned for how to apply that to year-round low barrier shelter that really adequately meets those needs. Also, as part of this conversation, I would definitely be open to exploring if there might be opportunities to bring our shelters together periodically. I think one of the things that came out of our racial equity analysis was that there's probably some opportunities for peer learning. I know that a lot of our shelters all serve different populations and are going to have some unique challenges, but I think there's going to be a lot of overlap, a lot of things that our shelters are going to have in common that we could probably go ahead and maybe look at setting up some meetings for the future for us just to have a regular platform that we could discuss those. And, you know, people might not feel comfortable to always have those conversations like in this room right now. They might want to deal with it in a thoughtful and sensitive way, and maybe kind of have some one-on-one conversations or conversations with their peers before we would bring something to the broader COC. I think there just might be some opportunities for us to make sure we're improving our communication and really helping to support one another in this work, and identifying in the process what we can do to better the system. Other thoughts on this item before we would move forward?
I just want to add a little bit to that. It's just slightly off topic, but there's been a huge increase in requests for people to come in with animals. And not just, sometimes I don't even say service animals. It used to hardly come up like once a year, but it's a lot now. And I think I've looked into it a little bit, and they do it pretty regularly out west. And there are a few different ways I think we could address it if we wanted to as shelters for even animals that aren't registered service animals. Out of all these animals, the ones that we've allowed, we've only had one animal that I think that's definitely a service dog. I mean, you know, it's well behaved, it doesn't flinch when people walk by it, but I think you have to look at more than that for people. It means a lot for them as to have that companionship. It'd be great if we could address it at some point.
Yeah, I know that Greenhouse has presented in program performance and evaluation about how meaningful their move to accept pets at the shelter has been in terms of reducing barriers to shelter and kind of just the difference that it can make in people's experience and their time at the shelter. Definitely want to make sure that we continue to look at that. I know, for example, for winter, we're trying to find strategies that we would be able to accommodate probably a significant number of pets. Looking at things like how do we, purchase or pursue kennels that can be available to make sure that those animals can safely stay overnight. I'm sure we're going to have to work on developing some basic rules and guidelines to make sure that that operates in a safe manner. I definitely understand that, and I think you're correct also in that many times, if we dig a little further, it might not be a fully registered service animal. So we need to think about the fact that we're looking at a mix of different kinds of pets or animals that we might see. And I know from some of our previous attempts to house some households, we're going to see everything from dogs and cats to pigs and guinea pigs and hamsters and everything in between.
Just my last thing, and then I'll be quiet, but I think the Humane Society, if we get to a point, might be willing to help us in some way. I don't know if it would be with manning the shelter or...
Yeah, so they have been willing in the past to do some things like temporarily board some animals. What I'm hoping to do is make sure that we're having some conversations with them as we approach winter so that they can help maybe inform our strategy, but also be looking at what we can do longer term and how they might be a part of that. I think that's definitely a valuable step that needs to be taken. And don't apologize for talking. That's what we want. I love it when somebody other than me is talking because then I go break. All right. If there's nothing else on this item, then Bo, we'd be good to move on to continuing business.
Great. Okay, so the first thing on continuing business is we are moving forward with further integrating input from people with lived experience into the continuum of care's processes. And the step that we're taking right now is there's a committee that is forming to begin discussing what that needs to look like. And that committee will have its first meeting on July 10th at 2 o'clock. Jeff, what's the location for that? Do we have one yet?
It's actually going to be here in this room. And I will make the note that ultimately, we want to meet in spaces other than this. What this first initial meeting is really going to be for is for us as a COC to go ahead and set some initial objectives around what we want to accomplish with this work group. And then I would like us to move towards developing a schedule for future meetings that would be in spaces and platforms so it'd be a little bit more accessible to those either experiencing homelessness or with lived experience. That would probably involve varying locations. I know that that can be a little bit of a challenge as we, in our busy day, try to remember where we're supposed to be. But I think if we can go ahead and establish that schedule in advance, we'll be able to reach more individuals with lived experience and make sure that we're not excluding somebody by, for example, always holding a meeting in one area of town. Even when we're talking about the downtown area, if we're consistently only on, say, the east side and meeting at White House, then we might be missing somebody who typically might have a little bit more of a tie to a different area of town or a different service provider. So I would definitely be open to any suggestions that folks would have, and this can be part of today's conversation, about spaces that we might want to pursue engagement or any organizations that would like to potentially host future meetings.
Great. And so are there any offerings of spaces that we could use?
What do we have access to right now?
So we would obviously have access to any space that LFUCG owns and operates, but I think that we've talked in the past about how that can be a little bit intimidating to those with lived experience. They might not feel comfortable coming into a government building. So I'm pretty certain that Tay would allow us to use the lighthouse over on Spruce Street. We could obviously have conversations with New Life Day Center, but beyond some of those that I'm immediately familiar with, I then get into the hurdle of one, who actually has a location that's accessible, a space within that location that we can actually hold enough people, and that's agreeable to letting us come in for this purpose. So that's going to be definitely something we need further input on. I don't have a lengthy list right off.
I'll just mention the Lexington Public Library does have various meeting room spaces. The capacity depends from branch to branch, but depending on the size of your group, that's an option for sure.
So I think probably Central would probably be the space that we would be most interested in. Do you know what kinds of capacity numbers that you guys presently have at Central?
Our large meeting room space has unfortunately shrunk to about 40 people. If needed, it's possible we could look at a larger group than that in a more open space, depending on the situation.
Okay, that's helpful because I know looking at the website, the options have changed a little bit from what I'd seen. Once upon a time, we had our board meetings in the basement, and it was a very large room, but I haven't seen that one available. So I knew that we were looking at slightly lower capacity limits, but I really would love to have some meetings in the library spaces. I think Central would be great, but I also would welcome input from you all in regards to what locations that you're actually seeing a lot of our population. I think sometimes we operate with the notion that everyone's in the downtown area, and that's not necessarily true. But do you have other locations that have a heavy touch to this population?
In my own experience, I've been at the Central Branch for the last year or so. In the time before that, I was definitely starting to see more folks at the Tates Creek branch, and I've noticed anecdotally folks, all throughout the city that I didn't see before, just as a person. I'm sure we've all seen that. But I can reach out to my colleagues and see if there are other locations where that's a accessible group that they're noticing in their daily interactions.
Yeah.
And I'm being reminded that the Farish Theater could be an option as well, depending on the nature of the meeting space that you're looking at.
Thank you.
Jeff, I don't think this is not working, but I would also say, I would think to consider the Northside Library, where now God's Pantry's in there, there's a lot more flow of that, impoverished or low income. And we know they have that big room if it's available.
And I'm pretty sure
Pretty accessible.
when we've had meetings there in the past, I think the staff have shared with us that they actually do see a significant amount of people from our population.
Especially being that close to the Hope Center and New Life, it's not downtown where,
I was going to add, so many of our churches offer ministries to our population, and maybe there's churches, they've all got a lot of space, especially during the week.
Yeah, since we don't always have those individuals at these meetings, I definitely welcome if you guys know that there's somebody in particular that you think would be worthwhile for us to reach out to. I'll have a couple of ideals, but I just want to make sure that we're not overlooking somebody just because we haven't necessarily seen them at other meetings. Are there other spaces that people would like to see us have a presence?
How many people would you anticipate coming out to the meetings?
So from the last advocacy committee meeting, the initial group that expressed interest was pretty small, but I sent that notice once I found a date that worked for those that I knew wanted to be at the table. Went ahead and sent that out to our entire listserv. We've already gotten several people to express that they have an interest. We even have someone coming from Kentucky Housing Corporation. They actually have funded a position specifically to do work with those that have lived experience, and they're interested in doing some partnerships so that we can work together, since we have so many individuals that would cross the boundaries back and forth between COCs. We just think there's some good opportunities there to align some of our strategies and make sure that we're helping each other and reaching out. So right now, it's really difficult to arrive at the actual number. I think we'll have more of a concept after the meeting on the 10th as to what that number would look like. I'm going to guess, just based on how typical COC meetings go, that we're probably going to be looking somewhere in the neighborhood of a maximum attendance of probably about 30 or so individuals. I would be surprised if we were much higher than that. As we actually manage to get folks with lived experience at the table, I think that's going to be the kind of the variable where I don't have a sense of what the number would be yet.
Because I was reflecting on what we have on Georgetown Street location, we got a conference room out there that, I mean, it's relatively small, especially when looking at this room, but, I mean, we might be able to offer something up there, so. And given where we are there on the Georgetown Street office, we got a lot of traffic through there too, so, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a decent sized room. I know I've done some different COC meetings there before. I think you guys have a pretty good technology set up too.
This will be very obviously weather dependent, but I know a lot of the parks, you can rent out their pavilions. Some of them are free, some of them cost money, but I know certainly a lot of this population tend to hang out in parks, so it might be a good way to draw some people in.
I think we might have a strategy for getting some of those fees waived. But yes, I think that's a great suggestion, and I think that's kind of some of the suggestions that we need. I think we need suggestions that help us think outside the box, because my immediate thought was indoor locations, but obviously that would add a whole different layer of accessibility, and then maybe if, for example, there's somebody who doesn't feel as comfortable in a confined space, that might be a more comfortable or friendly location for them. Other input before we move on? All right, well, definitely feel free to attend that meeting again. That is Monday, July 10th, here in this room at 2 p.m. We're planning an initial meeting of about an hour, and feel free to bring lots of ideals and energy to that meeting.
Great. Thank you. And next, Marissa has some program standards update.
Hello, we'll try this again. So the first item that I want to speak about regarding programs is our emergency shelter standards. As Jeff stated, clearly there is a concern of our emergency shelters to provide dignity for folks who are accessing our shelters and to remain adequately safe within those spaces, and we want to recognize that and make sure that these shelters or that these standards regarding our shelters are keeping that in mind. You know, always keeping the dignity of the population that we're serving first and foremost. Because of that, at our last meeting, we had discussed moving those standards forward, kind of with that caveat that we would be returning to our winter weather emergency plan kind of addendum. And I've reached out to the fire marshal about receiving those capacity numbers, what exactly that would look like. We're still ongoing and discussing that. And because our emergency shelters are clearly dealing with this in real time, we do think that it's important to make sure that we have a plethora of information that we're bringing to the table. So because the fire marshal is still getting back to me about the specifics for various emergency shelters, and because we want that discussion to be all-encompassing for all shelters to the table, as well as for everyone to have that knowledge of what that capacity actually is for their interim housing. We will not be voting on that today. There'll be an ongoing discussion moving forward. Are there any questions or concerns about that before moving on to our street outreach standards?
Does the fire marshal, do they also give a recommendation as far as what's allowed as oxygen tanks or compressors, depending on the layout of the shelter, things like that?
That's actually a really good point. We had not discussed that. We had talked about occupancy within various areas. For example, like the front lobby area versus actual designated sleeping quarters and what those requirements are for that. But we have not discussed about the actual specificity to that point. So I'm more than happy to bring that to them and also inquire about that as well. Great point. Is there anything else? Okay. Then moving on to our street outreach standards. These street outreach standards are developed in collaboration, of course, with all of our street outreach teams. That included our actual street outreach staff, those who are going out in the community every day, as well as the supervisors. So I do want to stress that the establishment of these standards were in full collaboration of everyone being involved. I also will say that there was a little bit of confusion about determining what exactly these standards are, who these standards are for. Again, these standards should serve as the floor, not the ceiling of what individuals should experience when interacting with our street outreach teams. So this is, again, floor, not the ceiling. This is the baseline treatment that all clients who are entering into our street outreach projects and interacting with street outreach staff will be experiencing. But then also the floor, not the ceiling, for those supervisors in hiring street outreach individuals, for what that project looks like, how we operate those projects, etc. These are standards that are for those street outreach teams that are formally a part of the COC as well. During our last Advocacy Issues and Programs Committee meeting, we had some individuals who asked and inquired about would these specific standards be set for like a church, for example, that was going out. And these would be standards that are for our COC, our formal street outreach teams. So I do want to clarify that as well. You will find those street outreach standards in 5B, number 2, for your review, but they do need a vote, and that would be a full continuum of care membership vote. So I'm happy to take any questions, comments, concerns that folks had in reviewing those standards in that document.
I have one question, probably not regarding the exact, it's related, but so like you said, these are expected to be followed by COC funded programming. Is there monitoring, what happens if obviously now, we have things happen, but in the past we've had issues, right? With things like, where it hasn't been a rule, but like it's implied, but like we're saying, here's the standards, you get this funding, you're expected to, like, is that like, I don't know if that's part of this or not.
Yeah, so just to chime in, this would be very similar to you guys participate in our rapid rehousing program standards. It's not necessarily intended to be a document that's going to keep you in full compliance, but it is something that we would expect you to operate by. Now, I don't think it's going to be something that's ideally going to be used punitively. It's not something that I want to use to take anyone's funding away, but more so just to make sure that we have some consistency and some standard of service. And we had talked about once we get this document finalized and approved, that then we would have standards developed for all 4 major program types. And then we'd like to start a quarterly review schedule. Because, for example, those rapid rehousing standards, we haven't had any meetings around those in probably now about 2 years. And so the landscape of what we do changes. And I want to make sure that we're coming together and identifying if there is something, for example, that you're having a difficulty in being able to meet a particular item or standard. We want that to be a conversation rather than something that is necessarily used to determine funding.
But it would be safe to assume as future funding becomes available and people are applying through COC funding for such programs that the standards will occasionally compare to the practices.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Yeah, definitely, like if somebody was wanting to apply for street outreach in the future, a good thing for them to do would be to pull this document and look at that to understand some of the expectations that there would be for that service.
And just speaking to that need for continual review as well, on page 9, we have our evaluation and planning. And you'll see that we don't have any specific measures tied to that. And part of that was very intentional because we went back and forth a lot about what exactly we should. And rather than make it arbitrary, this sounds like a good number, let's spend this first year actually recording this information. Now it's in our standards that you need to have this information recorded. This is data that you need to be collecting. That way we can ensure that we know what is our kind of baseline for our COC, and then where do we go from here as well. And ideally, right, we would be having those standards reviewed quarterly. That way, kind of, we can loop back around and say, okay, these measures, these goals, especially for something like street outreach, which does not have the same, guidance from HUD as our rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing projects, actually have realistic measures that we can attain and will move our street outreach teams forward and make them be successful in housing folks. Are there any other questions or concerns?
I might have skipped it. Does it say if the client files need to be paper or electronic?
It does not say. It says that if they are paper, they need to be stored in a secure location.
Could be either then.
But it could be either.
Yeah, we have some agencies that have pretty much entirely moved to electronic record systems, and we definitely are okay with that. We want to save some trees. It's oftentimes a lot easier to find things, so we're okay with whatever works for the organization as long as they would have a process that those can be secure, whether they're electronic or paper. Other discussion?
If not, I was just gonna probably say what Jeff was gonna say, which was if not, we do need a full continuum vote.
So is there a motion for approval?
I will make that motion.
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right.
Thank you.
Great, and next is an update from Jeff on IDs for those experiencing homelessness.
All right, so I didn't realize, but we're like right exactly around 3 months since we had implemented this program. The board had approved use of funds to help individuals obtain access of state IDs back in the tail end of winter, so that we were able to facilitate trying to eliminate some barriers to permanent housing for those that were staying at Safe Harbor initially. And that gave me an ability to get this process up and running with the state. There's definitely been a few things or challenges for us to learn, but I think that we've got a lot of this process now ironed out, and we've been able to open this up to our other emergency shelters and our street outreach teams. So at this point, I did prepare just a document in your packet that's going to be 5C. And that document is for the 3-month period from March 21st through June 21st. The board had originally approved use of a very odd and specific amount that we had remaining in our 22 funds, and that was just over $1,200. So one of the things I want to make sure that I'm bringing to the table is that we have some different numbers that we could potentially look at. So you're going to see funds encumbered. That would be letters that have been issued in which I have to anticipate we might need to pay out and have not yet been redeemed. Then we have funds expensed. Those are going to be letters that have been issued and actually redeemed by an individual to obtain a license, and it's been fully processed. As a reminder, this is a system where they have my Pro card on file, and they charge us at the time that the individual presents the letter at the office. So if I go basically off of what we've already paid out and those letters that we've already issued, we have just a little over $400 remaining. But you're going to see, obviously, that there is a significant gap between the letters that we've issued and those that have actually been redeemed. So one thing is this creates some challenges for me to do accurate accounting and to predict the number of persons that we can continue to serve on the program. That's going to be a little bit of a challenge. Those letters don't presently carry an expiration date, so ideally they could be presented at any time. And I don't really feel great about shutting off someone's access, but if we have hundreds of dollars that are tied up in letters that haven't been redeemed, how do I then continue to issue new letters and keep that access running? So I wanted you to have a little bit of information that you could see in kind of a data format that would show some of the issues I think that we're looking at. One would be, I think we need to be mindful that providing this letter alone is not reducing all the barriers that exist to obtaining an ID. We have to think about things like transportation. We need to think about follow-up contact. Even if you maybe don't have the ability to immediately schedule to help a client get transportation out to the local office, do you have the ability to at least go ahead and follow up with them and check and see, did they manage to get there? Did they obtain their ID? And then if not, maybe then you can prioritize finding a strategy to get them there, whether that be handing out a bus pass, taking folks in a group. For example, you're going to notice in some of these numbers that Community Action Council has one of the higher numbers of IDs that have actually been redeemed. Chastity, with their street outreach team, has on a couple of occasions gotten several clients together and taken a trip over. I think those are the kinds of strategies that we really need to remember are part of this. Also think about the fact that some people are going to have some challenges in terms of things like their mental health or their substance use that might make it difficult for them to navigate. I don't even like to go to the local office when I need to get my driver's license renewed. It's not necessarily something I look forward to. And so there's probably a lot of folks that we're serving that might need just a little extra encouragement or motivation to take this step. But again, this is not to critique any of these organizations in terms of the service that they've provided. It's just to help us understand in the broader context, just sending somebody with a letter, it's not alone going to always get the job done. Wanted to share also a couple of other reminders related to the program. One would be that there has been a minor change. Initially, when we talked about this, the charge was based on a debit card fee, and my Pro card can only be used as a credit card, so that fee has increased slightly. It's now a 2.8% fee instead of 1.5. That's going to be a difference of about 13 cents per ID. Not huge, but I want to be transparent about use of the funds and make sure that everybody's aware of that. And then just some reminders for organizations that would be participating. We see a lot of requests that we need minor tweaks to, and I want to make sure people have the information up front. It's easier to get everything you need when the client is in front of you, when you're in the field, versus having to go back and get things that maybe you missed the first time around. So that would be, we are required to submit an individual's full legal name. Part of this is that we have the flexibility where folks have previously had an ID issued in the state of Kentucky, that we might not be required to present the birth certificate and social security card. And for them to be able to look that up in their system, they need that individual's full legal name to be able to explore that. Additionally, if there's a middle initial, that tells me there's a middle name. So I need the full middle name and not just an initial. They also ask us for some ways to help identify the individual that's presenting the letter, just to verify that it's the right person who's getting access to that document. So for that purpose, we include race and gender just as kind of visual identifiers, as well as a photo is included on that letter. Just a note, if a photo is supposed to be intended to help identify a person. Make sure we can clearly see them and identify them. So avoid hats, hoods, sunglasses, or other things that might make it difficult for somebody to be identified. I don't know for sure that the state would reject a letter that had a photo like that, but my thoughts are I don't want to put either a staff member or a client in the position of going through the trouble of going to the office, then having this denial and having to start the process all over again. If we're trying to reduce barriers, I want to effectively reduce barriers. But definitely open to any conversation around the ID program. If anyone has anecdotes of their experience, suggestions on how to make sure clients are actually redeeming those letters, anyone has an interest in participating, definitely open to conversation.
I definitely see this issue every single day. I'm the social work student intern over at the library. I helped someone today look up how to get his birth certificate, and then after the birth certificate to obtain an ID. So to know that if they already have had an ID in the state of Kentucky and it can be looked up, like that would be huge for a lot of people that come and see me like every single day. So that's a resource that would absolutely be utilized at the library.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that maybe don't have direct experience. If you don't have any of those 3 items, it is incredibly difficult to get the others. And a success story I can share, we had a gentleman that had been discharged from a hospital and dropped off at Safe Harbor at the Lighthouse when they were operating the warming center. Clearly not appropriate for a shelter environment, definitely needed a higher level of care, but the hospital initially wasn't able to facilitate that and had to look at other discharge options. I don't agree with where we ultimately landed, but understand that they had barriers in actually connecting him to the level of care. Part of that was his lack of documentation. All of his documents had reportedly been stolen during his time experiencing homelessness. We were able to get him back to the hospital and admitted for care after a few days when they were able to go ahead and look at a different plan for him. Reach out to me to have this conversation about his documentation. He did happen to have a previous ID in Kentucky, and so that eliminated one of the major barriers. They were able to work with the Hope Center where he had previously stayed and use the Hope Center's ID and have their address and have them verify his homelessness. They were able to provide that letter. Staff from the hospital took him out to the office, and now he's going to be able to transition to a nursing home because he now has the identification that he needs, and they were able to gain access to those other documents because of it. So it really does make a world of difference in terms of solving that documentation conundrum that we often encounter. Also, make sure you have your client sign the letter. Thankfully, the state has been lovely in processing those requests, even if they're not signed. But I see a lot of them that are blank, and I, again, want to make sure that we're reducing any barriers. Any other thoughts or feedback around the state ID program?
I just want to suggest one thing we found helpful if they do have any of those IDs. When clients come in, if they have them, I scan them to our computer, and then if they lose them, at least it helps a little to have a copy of it, you know, and we keep it. It's not we try to get them to keep it too, but I find that helpful. And Chastity does do a great job, and she has come out to the Hope Center and met with our guys in groups, and because we've started to try to have the guys that are there during the day attend a class a day on life, and she comes and she's done that several times and has helped lots of guys get their IDs. So I'm thinking the group thing is not only more efficient, but I think they're more comfortable. It's just a great idea to try to do it in a group where you find people in mass. Also, what else? I didn't know there was a social work student at the library. Could you tell me more about that? Is there always one every semester, or?
No, I'm actually the guinea pig.
Oh, is there going to be one every semester? Depends on how she does.
Ideally.
Is that what you do essentially, is to connect with homeless mostly?
Yeah, usually the clientele that come in to see me are unhoused individuals or people. Someone came today who had just been at the hospital. People who have either, been unhoused or been at the hospital and have nowhere else to go and don't really know how to begin navigating resources. We started student social work hours at the beginning of June, and we've seen about 12 to 15-ish people, a couple repeat people that have come back, and I'm navigating all of that with one person individually right now. But now, she has a copy of the ID that she's had previously. So to know that all she has to do is to look that up and go get one, we've been like jumping through all these hoops. I can't wait to talk to her tomorrow and be like, look what we can do. But yes.
Well, that's great to know, just to know.
If we can spend just a moment more on that. Unfortunately, Dana will only be with us through early August. My name is Naomi. I'm a librarian at Central Library, and I'm working to help identify how we can expand our capacity and connect with other organizations in the city. However that's going to look going forward. It's definitely a priority of ours. We do see people homeless who've lost their IDs, had their IDs stolen daily, people, wearing hospital discharge bans frequently. It's possible that we should be a central player in helping to deal with this issue, or at least a player. So that's something I'm thinking I should take to our administration, but please do connect with me if you want to talk about that at any point.
Yeah, just in general, I think, how did we not think that there should be a social worker at the library all this time, especially downtown? That's a great idea.
Yeah, I was really encouraged to hear that they had someone that was able to do this work. We're really glad to have her, and we hope that it's just the first of many people that will fill this kind of role. And definitely, we're always glad to put you in touch with schools that approach us about having interns and practicums, because as not being a direct service organization, it really kind of depends on what the needs of that internship are. Sometimes we don't always have the ability to do internal internships that really connect people with a lot of direct client service. Sometimes we have to farm a lot of that out to our direct service providers, so I'd be glad to send people your way. One thing I just want to make sure is that the waiving of the Social Security card and the birth certificate, I know that they'll do that for those that are specifically going for the state ID program for those that are experiencing homelessness. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't do that necessarily if someone just came in off the street. But definitely that is something. So just work to make sure that she gets connected with one of the organizations that participates, and that letter should waive that requirement. Amber also made a great point regarding trying to help your clients where you can to keep some of this documentation. I'd also encourage our HMIS participating providers just to think about maybe uploading a copy of those documents electronically to their HMIS client profile. That can definitely help us out at a later time. We might be trying to facilitate something like a housing referral.
We'd be happy to do that. Is there any way, well, I guess I can connect with David. There's so many. I'd like to upload the ones with the housing referrals first. I guess I can connect with David for that, right? And also, as far as the driver's licensing office, go to the Spindletop location. They're lovely. I've had great experiences there.
Yeah, so we have been blessed with some great contacts at the state who have been really, really helpful. They've helped us iron out some of the hurdles that we initially had. For example, my Pro card, I have to have charges reconciled within 3 days. Usually the system does not send me a notice until day 2 or 3. And so then I have to reach out and say, hey, I need this receipt, and I need it within the next day. And if somebody's away from work, that can be then me being in trouble for not meeting the grace period. But they've found ways to get that to me more quickly, so we have that pretty much resolved. But yeah, they really do want this program to work and to be helpful. They've gone out of their way to be there to answer questions and to help construct this process to begin with. I think it's going to be a great strategy for us until we would actually have the benefits of House Bill 21 being in operation.
Jeff, from a medical respite standpoint, if we have a patient or individual that is in need, who would you want us to reach out to?
So I think the way that I've primarily been driving these is going to be around the fact that the organization has to be willing to use their address in place of the individual having an address on their physical ID. And so, like, for me, it doesn't make sense as LFUCG to directly be the one to list our address for that. I really don't think it's helpful for there to be a lot of people that are using the government center as their address. So it would really be best to kind of think about if they have connections to any of those organizations to where it might help them, first of all, receive the ID in the mail when it's ready. And then also things like where they would generally receive mail or have an opportunity to connect with someone. So the example that I gave of the gentleman that needed to get transitioned to a nursing home, we went back to the Hope Center where he had previously been so that they would be able to receive that ID. But also, if he was to return to homelessness, more than likely that would be an organization he's going to have contact with. So I'm usually just trying to identify either from the provider or from the individual who they already have an existing relationship with. Now, Bluegrass Care Navigators, if they were interested, we'd be able to install you on our account, and so you could submit those referrals and have it mailed to your address, as long as you were comfortable with your address also potentially being on someone's ID. Otherwise, it would just be trying to find that relationship. Other discussion on this item? All right. Then next, just a brief note around National Homeless Persons Remembrance Day. We did in May hold an initial meeting via Zoom of that group, and fully transparent, I dropped the ball in trying to go ahead and get an additional meeting scheduled with all the needs that this office has had. We are very much looking forward to receiving funding for an HMIS administrator in fiscal year 24. Even just one extra person in my office, it's going to make a world of difference. But I have not set the next meeting for that yet. I know initially we met via Zoom. I think the group as a whole has a desire to have some participation from folks that have lived experience. And I don't want to keep those future meetings on Zoom because I think that's going to be a barrier to participation. So just a couple of thoughts here. One would be, if there's anybody that's interested in maybe being part of the lead on this particular event to help so that it's not solely on this office to try to organize. If there's anybody that just feels like it really kind of fits the wheelhouse of what they do or they have a lot of ties to this, we'd just love to see, you know, one or more organizations that might want to help carry some of that responsibility. But also, before we would go ahead and set a next meeting, really would like to move this to in person at a space where anyone that wants to can participate. So definitely open to going ahead and looking ahead for setting that next meeting. Also glad to take any volunteers who want to have a help in actually kind of organizing. I see we're all so eager to take on more.
I think Greenhouse 17 will send someone. I think we sent Alyssa to the last one, so we'll send someone, but I don't know that she'd be in a space to take a lead. Is the woman that was here that presented in the beginning, who was so lovely, is she?
So,
do that? She was great.
I spoke to Dale via email today. She was not going to be able to join us today, but does want to come to the next meeting that we would move to schedule.
I vote her taking it over, but Greenhouse, we will send a staff person to be part of it.
So I will then reach out to Dale and let her know when you don't show up, you get voluntold.
I think that I've been
And you know firsthand. I'll see if she might have the capacity to help us with that and make sure that we would schedule something that would be conducive to her schedule, because if I can find someone who's willing to do it, I want to make sure they have the ability and we don't have to necessarily be the sole kind of organizer.
So I just say her.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be her, but she had nice thoughts about
Does anybody have anything that we need to consider in scheduling the next meeting? Does anybody want to volunteer a space? Does anybody that wants to participate have any notes around when we might schedule, like days or times that really don't work for you that we need to try to factor in?
I would think the central library would be a viable space for that whenever it's going to be.
All right, and when I'm ready to do that, do you want me to just reserve it through the website, or should I reach out to you personally to explore that? Or okay. Any other discussion on that event?
I wasn't here last time, so just to be clear, we're talking about not awareness, but remembrance of those who have been homeless who have passed away as individuals or a whole group?
Yeah, so it's a national event that a lot of different communities participate in. It's held on the same day every year as the first day of winter and the longest night of the year. The intent being that we would honor those that have passed away experiencing homelessness during the past year. And within that committee, we've had some discussions around how to approach that remembrance. A lot of people steer away from something like a reading of the names, because then there's a possibility of, for example, we're probably always going to not have knowledge of somebody, and we don't want it to look like we don't honor them as part of that. So a little bit individual, a little bit as a group. We talked about some strategies that might be able to mitigate, instead of maybe having a reading of the names, maybe have something that's more interactive, like a wall or a space or a vigil that's set up that people can actually place maybe a photo, a name, a memory, so that there's still that way to incorporate individuals without necessarily having to rely just on a reading of names. All right, if there's nothing else on this, we were trying to be mindful of the fact that a lot of people are on vacation and we tend to see lower attendance, so we didn't want to overload the agenda, but we would open the floor up for other issues and public sharing.
Can I add something from Lex TV?
Yeah.
You're looking for him over here. Hi. Thank you for recognizing me, even though I'm not in any way part of this. Thank you all for using the microphones. You are the first group, so you're kind of our guinea pigs. There are 24 of these. Everybody can have their own microphone for most groups. I'd say you all might be one of the few that has more than 24. If your red light was not working, please push your microphone in. A lot of times, I think we're going to run into people picking these up by the microphone and disconnecting them a little bit. That should take care of it. If you're not speaking, if you'll please turn off your microphone. We can only have 8 active speakers at a time. Shouldn't be an issue, but that just in case. Finally, when you leave, if you'll just set the microphones in the back of the room here at this back table, I will turn them all off and take care of them. Thank you all.
How do you turn them
All right, other announcements, public sharing?
Brief something. Should I try to do this? I'll practice with this. Okay. Can you all hear me? Hello. So I don't know how much this impacts folks that are in the room, but there has been a lot of conversation in the nonprofit world. Ampersand is going through a big transition. For folks that don't know Ampersand, they're the sexual assault program. The city of Lexington does have a domestic and sexual violence prevention coalition. We did have folks come together just in case anybody is needing sexual assault services, and due to the fact that they are now down to a staff of 3, they have a plan. They're working with Mountain Comp Care. They're wanting to make sure that somebody is able to answer the crisis line, do hospital calls, and be able to provide counseling and therapy. But with a staff of 3, that is a huge lift for them to make. And so the Prevention Coalition did post on their social media page. I think Greenhouse 17 is also posting that on their social media. So a lot of agencies that are kind of in that social services, survivor-centered world will have that. So if you need somebody who needs counseling or therapy and they can't get through to Ampersand, that should be your first call. But if you can't get through, we have compiled a list software places of people that they can receive some supportive services. So just sort of stay tuned and be on the lookout of that. You know, our hearts and thoughts are with Ampersand. I really don't know all the details around it, but we really want to make sure survivors aren't lost in that whole process. So there's been a lot of chat and conversation just to kind of keep a lot of supportive services around if needed. Ampersand, again, should be your first go-to, but if you're getting kind of lost in a shuffle, then we're posting a lot of information. Okay. I do, I can send it to you.
If you would want to send it to me, I'd be glad to send it out to the listserv.
Great, I'll do it.
I had a question. I hope I didn't miss this information, but is there's the same thing with like the winter, cold weather, other emergencies for the heat related shelter? Is there emergency services for that, for housing people when it becomes staggeringly hot?
So we do have a plan. It's not going to be as robust as the winter plan. It's actually not operated by my office. We are part of the Department of Emergency Management's broader plan to address heat emergencies. And so my office, the part that we would have in that is making sure that we would reach out to our partner organizations when there are going to be heat-related emergencies to make them aware of activation of the plan and what phases specifically. During those activations, at any phase of activation, individuals that are experiencing homelessness are able to board a Lextran bus and get free transportation to a cooling station. Typically, that's going to involve a lot of our existing shelter and day center options that are going to operate. And then in terms of the actual housing of persons, unfortunately, we don't have resources to do the kind of motel programs that we did over the winter and the summer. And because it's less of a threat to someone's well-being in terms of the nighttime hours, temperatures usually do drop to more reasonable levels. We don't focus as much on the overnight shelter as having teams that would go out and distribute supplies and help transport persons to the cooling stations. I'll also share an announcement regarding the Continuum of Care's website. Again, that would be lexendhomelessness.com. So over the last couple of weeks, we've made some minor updates to that website. First, if you've not heard or seen of this other places, we have made a change with our data dashboard. We had one data dashboard before that was really intensive for us to update. And we now have 3 data dashboards that kind of examine data at different levels. And those are much easier for this office to update and maintain. Those are pre-funded through our campaign with Untold Content. So we're going to have use of those for 3 years. And that gives us time to look ahead and see if we might have resources in the future, something that has Tableau knowledge to be able to develop our own dashboards, or if we want to continue with this service, we can identify funding. But I think they're a lot easier to use, a lot easier for folks to understand what those metrics and data are actually saying. So definitely check those out and share those with anybody that has an interest in this subject. All 3 of those are live on our website now. Additionally, we now have a resources for partners page on the website. If you look under the partners subheading in the navigation menu, you'll find a link for resources to partner, and there's going to be links there to things like federal and local strategic plans, HMIS forms and information and documents, policies and related forms for coordinated entry or the housing triage system. Basically a lot of the different materials, program standards documents that we have shared through our Google Drive in the past. We just now have a lot of those links and information centralized and a little bit easier for our partners to find. Other announcements? All right. Then our next meeting will be here on August 23rd at 1:30 p.m. We hope to have you back with us. We'll stick around for a few. If anyone needs to chat with us, please remember to help Haley and myself out and get your batteries over to the station to charge.
Will it be 1 or 1:30?
1:30.
Oh, okay, because I showed up at 1 today, and I thought you said 1 just now.
I'm sorry if I did.
I don't know.
I might just have too much going on in my brain. So it's supposed to be 1:30.
We're done.
I think, can we get a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Second? Second. All right. All in favor? Any opposed? Great, yes, it's over.